The cold autumn wind whistled through the empty streets of Cedar Grove as Officer James Miller settled into his patrol car for another night shift. At 43, he was a veteran of the force with 15 years under his belt, and night patrols had become second nature to him. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:45 p.m., just a little over an hour left before his shift would end. Miller took a slow sip from his lukewarm coffee, his tired eyes scanning Highway 27 for any signs of trouble. The road was quieter than usual for a Friday night, with only occasional cars passing by. The weather forecast had warned of rain, and dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening to unleash their burden at any moment. As he pulled up to his favorite surveillance spot, a small clearing just off the highway's shoulder, Miller's mind wandered to his daughter's upcoming soccer game on Sunday. She was 12 now, growing up so fast it sometimes scared him. Working these late shifts meant missing many family moments, but his wife Susan understood. It was part of the job. The radio crackled to life, breaking his reverie. All units in the vicinity of Highway 27 be advised of reports of erratic driving in your area. Silver Honda Civic, license plate potentially starting with XRJ. Miller straightened in his seat, his eyes now alert and focused on the road ahead. Years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about this call felt different. He acknowledged the dispatch and began watching the traffic more intently. 20 minutes passed without incident. The rain had started, creating a gentle rhythm against the car's roof. Miller was about to change positions when he spotted headlights in his rearview mirror. A silver Honda Civic approached, moving slightly slower than the speed limit, but something about its movement caught his attention. The car was drifting slightly between lanes, correcting itself in jerky movements. "This might be our vehicle," Miller muttered to himself, pulling out onto the highway. He followed the car for a quarter mile, confirming his suspicions as he watched it weave subtly across the white lines. With practiced efficiency, he switched on his cruiser's lights and gave a short siren burst. The Civic's reaction was delayed, but it eventually pulled over to the shoulder, stopping at an awkward angle. Miller radioed in his location and the traffic stop, following protocol even though this seemed like a routine drunk driving check. He noted the license plate, XRJ 247, matching the earlier alert's description. As he prepared to exit his vehicle, Miller went through his mental checklist. He adjusted his body camera, ensuring it was recording, and grabbed his flashlight. The rain had picked up, and he could barely make out the silhouette of the driver through the car's rear window. Following procedure, Miller approached the vehicle from the driver's side, staying slightly behind the pillar. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the car's interior. The driver was a woman, perhaps in her mid-40s, with disheveled brown hair. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Officer Miller with the Cedar Grove Police Department," he said, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I noticed some irregular driving patterns. Have you had anything to drink tonight?" The woman's response came quick, too quick. No, officer, I'm just tired. I've been driving for hours, trying to get to my sister's house. She's sick, you see. I'm sorry about the driving, I really am." Miller's trained ear picked up the nervous edge in her voice. Something wasn't right. He swept his flashlight beam across the car's interior, following standard procedure, and that's when he saw it, or rather, saw her. In the back seat, partially hidden behind the driver's seat, was a small girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing what looked like pink pajamas. Their eyes met in the reflection of the car's window, and Miller felt his blood run cold. The girl's face was eerily familiar. He had seen it just hours ago during the evening briefing on a missing persons report. Sarah Martinez, age 7, abducted from Riverside Park 2 days ago. The photo from the report flashed in his mind, matching perfectly with the frightened face staring back at him. Miller's heart rate quickened, but years of training kept his exterior calm. He needed to handle this carefully. One wrong move could put the child in danger. As rain continued to pour down around them, Officer Miller realized this was no longer a routine traffic stop. It was about to become the most important moment of his career. Officer Miller's mind raced as he maintained his composed exterior. He knew the next few minutes would be crucial. The woman in the driver's seat was not Sarah Martinez's mother. He remembered the mother's photo from the missing persons report all too clearly. This situation required careful handling. "Ma'am, I'll need to see your license and registration, Miller said, keeping his voice steady. His right hand rested casually near his service weapon, a habit born from years of experience. The rain continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of water that isolated their interaction from the rest of the world. The woman fumbled through her purse, her hands shaking visibly. "Of course, officer. Just give me a moment." Her voice trembled slightly as she searched. In the back seat, Sarah remained silent, but her eyes never left Miller's face in the reflection. While waiting, Miller subtly pressed the button on his radio twice, a silent signal to dispatch indicating he needed immediate backup. It was a code developed for situations exactly like this, where officers couldn't openly call for help without alerting suspects. "Here you go," the woman said, handing over a driver's license and registration with trembling fingers. Miller accepted them, noting how the edges of the license seemed slightly off, the telltale sign of a forgery he'd learned to spot during his training. "Ms. Rebecca Thompson," he read aloud, knowing full well this wasn't her real name. "And you said you're heading to your sister's house?" He kept his flashlight beam partially directed toward the back seat, ensuring he could see Sarah in his peripheral vision. Yes, in Millbrook." "She's very ill," the woman replied, her story becoming more elaborate. "My niece here," she gestured to Sarah, "wanted to come along to see her aunt." Miller noticed Sarah flinch at the word niece. The girl's eyes widened, and she slowly shook her head, almost imperceptibly. His training kicked in again. He needed to keep the woman talking while backup arrived. "That's quite a drive at this hour," he commented, pretending to examine the documents more closely. "Especially with a young one in the car. How long have you been on the road?" The woman's story began to unravel as she spoke. She mentioned leaving at sunset but then changed it to afternoon. She couldn't remember her sister's exact address in Millbrook. Each question revealed more inconsistencies, while Sarah remained unusually quiet in the back seat. Through his earpiece, Miller heard the faint confirmation he'd been waiting for. "Units en route to your location, ETA 3 minutes." He needed to keep the situation under control for just a little longer. "Ma'am, would you mind stepping out of the vehicle for a moment?" Miller asked, maintaining his professional demeanor. "I need to discuss something about your registration." The woman's face paled. Is that really necessary, officer? It's raining quite hard, and I wouldn't want to leave my niece alone." "It will only take a minute," Miller insisted, his hand still near his weapon. "Standard procedure." As the woman reluctantly reached for her door handle, Sarah suddenly spoke up, her voice small but clear. "Please help me. She's not my aunt." The woman froze. In that split second, everything changed. She slammed her car into drive, but Miller was faster. He reached through the window, grabbing the gear shift and yanking the keys from the ignition in one swift motion. "Don't move," he commanded, drawing his weapon as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. "Hands where I can see them." 2 patrol cars arrived within seconds, their lights cutting through the rain. Officers rushed out, taking control of the situation. Miller kept his weapon trained on the woman until his colleagues had her secured, then immediately moved to the back door. Sarah was shaking but conscious. As Miller opened the door, she practically fell into his arms, sobbing. "I want my mommy," she cried, clinging to his rain-soaked uniform. "You're safe now," Miller assured her, wrapping her in the emergency blanket from his car. "We're going to take you home to your mommy very soon." As paramedics arrived to check on Sarah, Miller watched the woman being placed in a patrol car. The rain had finally begun to ease, and with it, the tension of the last 15 minutes. One thought kept running through his mind. Sometimes, routine traffic stops were anything but routine. The Cedar Grove police station buzzed with activity despite the late hour. Officer Miller sat with Sarah in the break room, making sure she felt safe while waiting for her parents to arrive. The little girl clutched a cup of hot chocolate, her hands still trembling slightly, but her eyes were clearer now, more focused. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had taken charge of the case, and she sat across from Sarah, asking gentle questions about her ordeal. Miller remained nearby, having become a source of comfort for the child. After years on the force, he learned that rescued children often bonded with the officer who saved them. "Can you tell me what happened at the park, Sarah?" Detective Rodriguez asked softly, her notebook ready. "Take your time, sweetheart." Sarah's grip tightened on her cup. I was playing on the swings. Mommy was sitting on the bench, watching me. Then a lady came and said my mommy wanted me to come see something cool behind the trees. She paused, taking a shaky breath. But when I went there, another lady grabbed me really fast and put me in a car. Miller felt his jaw clench. 2 kidnappers, the one he'd caught and another still out there. Rodriguez caught his eye, nodding slightly to acknowledge the significance of this information. "You're very brave for telling us this," Rodriguez said. "Can you remember anything about the other lady?" Before Sarah could answer, commotion erupted in the hallway. "Where is she? Where's my baby?" A woman's voice cried out. Seconds later, Sarah's mother burst through the door, followed closely by her father. "Mommy, Daddy," Sarah leaped from her chair, spilling her hot chocolate as she ran into her parents' arms. The reunion brought tears to everyone's eyes, even the veteran officers in the room. Mrs. Martinez held her daughter tightly, sobbing, while Mr. Martinez wrapped his arms around them both. "Thank you," he managed to say through his tears, looking at Miller. "Thank you for bringing our little girl back." Meanwhile, in another part of the station, the woman from the car, now identified as Catherine Wells, was being interrogated. Initial background checks had revealed a history of minor crimes, but nothing that suggested involvement in child trafficking. The discovery worried the investigators. It meant they were dealing with something bigger than they'd initially thought. Miller was called into the interrogation room to give his statement. Wells sat there, handcuffed to the table, looking much smaller and more defeated than she had in the car. Detective Johnson, known for his skill in breaking tough cases, led the questioning. "Ms. Wells," Johnson began, "we know you're not working alone. The sooner you talk, the better it will be for you." Wells stared at her hands, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If I talk, they'll kill me." "We can protect you," Johnson assured her. "But right now, other children might be in danger. You need to help us stop this." The mention of other children seemed to crack something in Wells. She looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I was just the transport," she said. "They have a whole network. They told me it was just a one-time thing, just drive the girl from point A to point B. I didn't know. I didn't know they did this regularly." As Wells began to reveal more details, Miller felt a chill run down his spine. She described an organized trafficking ring operating across 3 states, using seemingly ordinary people as transporters. The operation was sophisticated, with multiple safe houses and a complex communication system. Back in the break room, Sarah had fallen asleep in her mother's arms. The Martinezes agreed to bring her back tomorrow for a more detailed statement, once she'd had time to rest and feel secure. As Miller watched them leave, Rodriguez approached him with a grim expression. "This is bigger than anything we've handled before," she said quietly. "Wells' information matches some unsolved cases in neighboring states. We're going to need federal involvement." Miller nodded, his mind already racing with the implications. What had started as a routine traffic stop was evolving into something much larger, a chance to break open a major criminal operation. As he finally prepared to head home, hours after his shift should have ended, he knew this case was far from over. Sarah was safe, but somewhere out there, other children might still be in danger. The next morning, the Cedar Grove police station transformed into a hub of intense activity. FBI agents had arrived early, setting up a command center in the conference room. Officer Miller walked in at 7 a.m., despite having left just 4 hours earlier. Dark circles hung under his eyes, but the importance of the case kept him alert. Special Agent Maria Ramirez led the federal task force. She stood at the front of the room, pinning photos and documents to a large evidence board. "Officer Miller," she called out when she saw him. "Just the person I needed to see. Your dash cam footage might have caught something crucial." Miller joined her at the board, where photos from his patrol car's camera were spread out. The nighttime images showed the silver Honda from different angles, but what caught his attention was a small detail he'd missed during the stop: a faded bumper sticker partially hidden under road grime. "This sticker," Ramirez pointed, "matches ones we found on 3 other vehicles involved in trafficking cases across state lines. It's their marking system, hiding in plain sight." The investigation room buzzed with energy as more pieces fell into place. Catherine Wells had spent the night talking, her fear of her associates finally outweighed by her guilt. She provided names, locations, and most importantly, details about their next planned operation. They work in cells, Ramirez explained to the assembled team. Each cell operates independently, but they're all connected through a central coordinator, someone Wells only knows as the manager. From what we gathered, they're planning another abduction within the next 48 hours. Miller felt his stomach turn. The thought of another child going through what Sarah had experienced was unbearable. He studied the evidence board, trying to spot any patterns they might have missed. Detective Rodriguez entered the room, carrying a fresh stack of papers. Sarah's full statement just came in, she announced. She remembered something important about the second kidnapper, a distinctive turtle tattoo on her wrist. This detail caused a stir among the FBI agents. Agent Ramirez quickly pulled up a database on her laptop. "This matches the description from a case in Riverside last year," she said, her voice tense with excitement. "We thought that perpetrator had left the state, but she might be our link to the manager." As the morning progressed, more evidence emerged. Wells' phone records revealed a pattern of calls to a warehouse district just outside the city. Satellite images showed unusual activity around several buildings in the area. Miller couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. He remembered Sarah's frightened eyes in his flashlight beam, thinking about how many other children might be experiencing that same fear right now. Around noon, Sarah and her parents returned to the station for a follow-up interview. The little girl looked better after a night's rest, though still understandably shaken. When she saw Miller, she ran to give him a hug. Officer Miller caught the bad lady, she told Agent Ramirez proudly during her interview. He wasn't scared of her at all. Miller, who had stayed for the interview at Sarah's request, felt his throat tighten with emotion. The truth was, he had been scared, not for himself, but for Sarah and all the other children who might be in danger. The interview revealed more crucial details. Sarah remembered overhearing her captors talking about a delivery schedule and mentioned seeing other children at the place where they kept her. Each detail was another piece of the puzzle, bringing them closer to uncovering the full scope of the operation. As the day wore on, a plan began to take shape. The FBI, working with local law enforcement, would set up surveillance on the suspected warehouse locations. Wells had indicated that the next operation was scheduled for tomorrow night, giving them limited time to prepare. "Officer Miller," Agent Ramirez called out as the briefing concluded. "I want you on the tactical team for tomorrow. Your instincts during the traffic stop saved Sarah's life. We need those instincts for this operation." Miller nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This case had become more than just a routine traffic stop or even a single rescue. It was a chance to dismantle an entire trafficking network and prevent countless other children from experiencing the trauma Sarah had endured. As he headed home to get some rest before tomorrow's operation, Miller knew that the most challenging part of this case was still ahead of them. The real test would come in the next 24 hours. The warehouse district loomed dark and imposing in the twilight hours. Officer Miller sat in an unmarked vehicle with Agent Ramirez, watching through binoculars as a white van pulled up to one of the suspected buildings. It was 8:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the suspected operation was set to begin. Movement at the south entrance. Miller whispered into his radio, observing a figure emerging from the shadows. The person matched the description of the second kidnapper Sarah had mentioned, a woman with a turtle tattoo on her wrist. Inside the command center van parked 2 blocks away, Detective Rodriguez coordinated with surveillance teams positioned around the perimeter. They had eyes on every exit, and SWAT teams were ready to move on command. The operation had to be perfectly timed. Too early, and they might miss catching the ringleaders. Too late, and more children could be in danger. Catherine Wells had been relocated to a safe house, but not before providing crucial information about the night's planned operation. The trafficking ring was expecting a delivery of 3 children, snatched from different locations across the city. The thought made Miller's blood boil. "Target vehicle approaching from the east," Ramirez announced quietly. A black SUV with tinted windows crawled past their position. Through the binoculars, Miller could make out 2 adults in the front seats, but the back windows were too dark to see inside. The radio crackled. "All units stand by. Wait for confirmation before moving in." Rodriguez's voice was steady, professional. They couldn't risk spooking the suspects before identifying all players involved. The next 10 minutes felt like hours. More vehicles arrived, another van, 2 seconds. People moved between the buildings, speaking in hushed tones. Miller's trained eye counted 12 suspects in total, more than they'd initially anticipated. Suddenly, a child's cry pierced the night air. Miller's hand instinctively moved to his weapon, but Ramirez gripped his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "We need to identify the manager." Their patience was rewarded moments later when a luxury car pulled up to the main entrance. A well-dressed man stepped out, his bearing suggesting authority. He matched Wells' description of the manager perfectly: tall, silver-haired, with a distinctive limp in his right leg. "Target confirmed," Ramirez spoke into her radio. "All units prepared to move on my mark." The scene unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. As the manager entered the warehouse, followed by his associates, SWAT teams silently took their positions. Miller and Ramirez moved forward, keeping to the shadows. Through a grimy window, they could see inside. The sight made Miller's jaw clench. 3 children, no older than Sarah, huddled together in a corner. Armed guards stood nearby while the manager spoke with what appeared to be buyers. "All units in position," Rodriguez confirmed over the radio. Ramirez took a deep breath. "Execute now. Go, go, go." The next few minutes were chaos. SWAT teams breached the building from multiple entry points. Flashbangs disoriented the suspects. Miller moved in with his team, years of training guiding his actions. "Police, don't move. Hands where we can see them." Some suspects surrendered immediately. Others tried to run. The manager pulled a weapon, but before he could use it, Miller tackled him to the ground. The silver-haired man fought viciously, but Miller's determination won out. "It's over," Miller said as he secured the handcuffs around the manager's wrists. "Your operation is finished." Throughout the warehouse, similar scenes played out. Suspects were arrested, weapons were secured, and most importantly, the children were rescued. Paramedics rushed in to check on them while officers cleared the building. Agent Ramirez surveyed the scene with satisfaction. 13 arrests, including the manager and all key players. This is going to shut down trafficking operations across 3 states. Miller's attention was focused on the rescued children, now being wrapped in blankets and comforted by female officers. They reminded him so much of Sarah, scared, confused, but alive and now safe. "Officer Miller," Ramirez called out, "we found documents in the manager's car. This operation was bigger than we thought. We're going to need your help with the follow-up investigation." Miller nodded, watching as the suspects were led away to waiting police vehicles. What had started with a simple traffic stop had led to the breakup of a major trafficking ring. But more importantly, 3 more children would be returning to their families tonight. As the adrenaline of the raid began to fade, Miller thought about Sarah, safe at home with her parents. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest cases start with the smallest moments of attention to detail. The following days at the Cedar Grove police station were a whirlwind of activity. Officer Miller found himself moving between witness interviews, evidence processing, and coordinating with FBI agents as they unraveled the full extent of the trafficking operation. The manager, now identified as Richard Conway, a former business executive, remained stubbornly silent in custody. One morning, 3 days after the raid, Miller arrived at the station to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the lobby, Sarah Martinez and her mother. The little girl's face lit up when she saw him. "Officer Miller." Sarah ran to greet him, looking healthier and happier than he'd seen her since the rescue. "I saw you on TV. They said you helped save more kids." Mrs. Martinez approached with tears in her eyes. "We've been following the news. Those other families. They're getting their children back because of what started with Sarah's rescue. We had to come and thank you again." Miller knelt to Sarah's level. "How are you doing, Sarah? Are you feeling better?" The child nodded, reaching into her backpack. "I made something for you in therapy." She pulled out a colorful drawing showing a police car, a little girl, and an officer standing tall in a blue uniform. The words "My Hero" were written across the top in crooked crayon letters. Before Miller could respond, Detective Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Miller, we need you in interrogation. One of Conway's associates is ready to talk." In the interrogation room, the woman with the turtle tattoo, identified as Linda Morris, sat slumped in her chair. Unlike Conway, the weight of her actions seemed to be crushing her. "I never meant for it to go this far," she began, her voice trembling. At first, it was just delivering packages. Then Conway offered more money for special deliveries. I told myself the kids were going to better homes. She broke down, sobbing. I was lying to myself. Morris's testimony proved invaluable. She revealed details about trafficking routes, other associates, and most importantly, the locations of more safe houses across state lines. Her information would lead to dozens more arrests in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, Agent Ramirez had been digging into Conway's background. She called a briefing to share her findings. Richard Conway built his network using his business connections, she explained, pointing to a complex chart on the wall. He used legitimate shipping companies as fronts, had contacts in child protective services who helped identify vulnerable targets, and maintained offshore accounts to hide the money trail. Miller studied the evidence board, now covered with photos and documents. What about the families of the children we rescued from the warehouse? All 3 children have been reunited with their parents, Rodriguez answered. They're receiving counseling, like Sarah. The youngest one started talking yesterday, gave us information about 2 more locations where he was held. The investigation expanded rapidly. Each new lead uncovered more connections, more suspects, more victims. Miller found himself working long hours, driven by the memory of Sarah's frightened face in his flashlight beam that rainy night. One evening, as he was reviewing case files, Chief Anderson called him into his office. Miller, the FBI is formally requesting your assistance on their task force, the chief said. They want you to help coordinate similar operations in other jurisdictions. Your experience with the initial traffic stop and the warehouse raid has made you valuable to this investigation. Miller thought about Sarah's drawing, now pinned to his desk. He thought about the other children still out there, waiting to be rescued. When do they need me to start? Next week, but first, there's something else. The chief smiled, pulling out an envelope. The mayor wants to present you with a commendation. The ceremony is on Friday. Miller shook his head. Chief, I was just doing my job. That night, with Sarah, any officer would have done the same. But it was you who noticed something wasn't right. You who kept your cool and saved that little girl. Sometimes the biggest cases break because one officer pays attention to the small details. As Miller left the office, he passed the break room where Sarah had sat drinking hot chocolate that first night. He remembered her trembling hands, her frightened eyes. Now she was safe, back with her family, drawing pictures and healing. And because of her rescue, other children were being saved too. The case was far from over, but Miller felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. Sometimes, he realized, the most important moments in life come disguised as routine traffic stops on rainy nights. 3 months after the warehouse raid, Officer Miller stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a room full of law enforcement officials from across the country. The trafficking case had grown far beyond Cedar Grove, leading to the largest child trafficking bust in recent history. It started with a simple traffic stop, Miller began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. A silver Honda driving erratically, a frightened child in the back seat, and an officer's gut feeling that something wasn't right. Since then, our joint task force has rescued 67 children and arrested over 100 suspects across 12 states. In the audience, Agent Ramirez nodded approvingly. The case had transformed her career as well, earning her a promotion to lead a new specialized unit dedicated to fighting child trafficking. But today's briefing wasn't about celebrating successes. It was about preparing for the challenges ahead. Richard Conway's network was just the tip of the iceberg, Miller continued, clicking through slides showing surveillance photos and evidence. His cooperation, though limited, has helped us identify 3 more trafficking rings operating on the East Coast. The investigation had taken unexpected turns. Conway, facing multiple life sentences, had finally started talking after prosecutors discovered his connection to international trafficking operations. His testimony implicated high-ranking officials and wealthy businessmen who had helped finance the network. After the briefing, Miller checked his phone to find a message from Detective Rodriguez back in Cedar Grove. Sarah Martinez's therapy was going well, and she had started speaking at school assemblies about stranger danger and safety. Her courage in telling her story had inspired other young survivors to come forward. Officer Miller, a voice called out as he left the conference room. It was FBI Director Thompson. Walk with me for a moment. They moved through the busy hallways of the FBI headquarters. The task force needs someone to lead its new training division, Thompson said. Someone who understands how these cases can break from the smallest details. Someone who can teach other officers what to look for during routine stops. Miller thought about his life in Cedar Grove, his family, his patrol route, the familiar streets he protected for 15 years. But he also thought about the children still out there, waiting to be rescued. "Can I have some time to think about it?" he asked. "Of course," Thompson replied. "But remember, you've already helped save dozens of lives. Think how many more you could save by teaching others what you know." That evening, Miller visited the National Law Enforcement Memorial Wall. Among the names of fallen officers, he found himself reflecting on how a single traffic stop had changed so many lives, not just Sarah's, but all the other children who had been rescued because of that rainy night. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. She'd attached a photo. Sarah Martinez had stopped by the Cedar Grove station that afternoon to deliver thank you cards to everyone who had helped with her case. In the picture, she stood proudly next to Miller's empty desk, placing a new drawing beside her original one. The next morning, Miller met with Ramirez to review new case files. Conway's testimony had led them to a warehouse in Baltimore where another rescue operation was being planned. "We've identified 3 children who may be there," Ramirez explained, spreading photos across the table. "The pattern matches Conway's operation, using legitimate businesses as cover, moving the children at night." As they planned the raid, Miller received another message, this time from Sarah's mother. The little girl had been asked to testify before Congress about child trafficking. She wanted to know if Officer Miller would be there to support her. Looking at the Baltimore case files, then at Mrs. Martinez's message, Miller made his decision. He called FBI Director Thompson. "About the training division position," he said. "I'll take it on one condition. I want to stay involved in active cases. These children need more than just rescued. They need to know someone cares enough to follow through, to make sure they're truly safe." Thompson agreed immediately. "That's exactly why we want you, Miller. You've never seen these cases as just files on a desk. You see the children behind them." As Miller hung up, he looked at the photo of Sarah by his desk. The scared little girl from that traffic stop had transformed into a brave survivor, helping other children find their voices. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest changes come from the smallest moments of courage, both from the children they rescued and the officers who refused to look the other way. 1 year after the fateful traffic stop, Officer James Miller stood in the back of a packed congressional hearing room. Sarah Martinez, now 9 years old, approached the podium adjusted to her height. Her parents sat nearby, beaming with pride as their daughter prepared to address the Congressional Committee on Child Protection. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Last year, a police officer named James Miller saved my life because he paid attention when something didn't look right. Because of him, I get to stand here today. Because of him, many other kids like me got to go home to their families." Miller felt his throat tighten with emotion. In the past year, his work with the FBI's new trafficking task force had led to the rescue of over 200 children. The training program he developed had been implemented in police departments across the country, teaching officers to spot the subtle signs he'd noticed that rainy night. Richard Conway had received multiple life sentences, and his testimony had helped dismantle 3 major trafficking networks. The woman with the turtle tattoo, Linda Morris, was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for her cooperation, which had proved invaluable in understanding how the traffickers operated. After Sarah's testimony, the committee announced new legislation to increase funding for anti-trafficking task forces and victim support services. They named it the Sarah's Law, in honor of the brave little girl whose rescue had sparked a national movement. Outside the hearing room, Sarah ran to give Miller a hug. "Did I do okay?" she asked, looking up at him with bright eyes that no longer held any fear. "You did amazing," he assured her. "You're helping a lot of other kids by telling your story." Mrs. Martinez approached with tears in her eyes. "We have some news," she said. "Sarah's been invited to speak at police academies about her experience. The instructors think it will help new officers understand what to look for, hearing it from her perspective." Miller smiled, remembering how this had all started with a simple traffic stop on Highway 27. Now he split his time between training officers, coordinating rescue operations, and mentoring survivors like Sarah who wanted to help others. Later that evening, Miller attended a ceremony at the National Law Enforcement Training Center. The first graduating class of his specialized anti-trafficking program was receiving their certificates. 50 officers from departments across the country had completed the intensive training, learning to spot the signs that could lead to another rescue. Remember, Miller told the graduates, every traffic stop, every routine call, every moment on patrol could be the one that saves a life. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to the details. Someone's child might be counting on you to notice something others miss. After the ceremony, Agent Ramirez shared some news. The Baltimore warehouse operation they planned a year ago had led to an international breakthrough. Investigators have followed the money trail to trafficking operations in 3 other countries. Joint task forces were now being formed to coordinate global rescue efforts. None of this would have happened if you hadn't noticed something wrong with that Honda Civic, Ramirez said. Sometimes the biggest cases break because one officer refuses to look the other way. As Miller drove home that night, he passed a patrol car making a routine traffic stop. He smiled, knowing the officer had been through his training program. Every night, across the country, officers were using what they'd learned to look beyond the obvious, to notice the small details that might lead to another rescue. At home, Miller found a new drawing from Sarah on his desk, this one showing her speaking at Congress, with him standing proudly in the background. Below it, she'd written, "Thank you for teaching other police officers to save kids like me." The next morning would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, Miller sat in his office, looking at Sarah's drawing and reflecting on how a single moment of attention during a routine traffic stop had created ripples that continued to save lives. The phone on his desk rang. Another possible trafficking case had been identified by a patrol officer in Seattle. As Miller picked up the receiver, he smiled. The officer had noticed something unusual during a routine traffic stop and remembered his training. Sometimes, the greatest changes in the world start with one person paying attention at exactly the right moment. For James Miller, that moment had come on a rainy night with a silver Honda Civic, and its effects would continue to change lives for years to come.